you do have a Bible, I invite you to open this morning to Psalm 132. Psalm 132. Over the last 4 weeks, we've been on a journey through song as we've been exploring the Psalms of Ascent. This collection of 15 songs compiled over many years by Israel, compiled into a songbook for traveling pilgrims who are making their way to Jerusalem for gathered worship. In these songs, they contain stories of Israel's history, some of which we'll notice today in Psalm 132. They express the reality of living the everyday life in this world, and they are full of rich doctrine on the person and work of God. And these songs fill the time and they motivate the people as they journey from their homes, scattered wherever, to Jerusalem. And over throughout these songs, the people of Israel are reminded that the pilgrim on their way to Zion is headed in the right direction. And as we sit here a few thousand years after the writing of these Psalms, we are also reminded of Israel's history. We are reminded of the reality of living in this sin-cursed world. And we are brought to focus on God and His amazing work in our lives. And for us, those who are pilgrims in this world, those who are seeking the Lord, those who long after His words and ways, we are headed in the right direction. Now, over the last 4 weeks, we've already explored 12 of these Psalms. We've looked at 3 Psalms each week, and I know in some ways that's felt like we've kind of rushed through some of this. However, as we come to the fifth and final set of 3 songs, we're going to slow down a bit, and we're going to explore each song on its own. And the reason for that, is, as we've been mentioning, is because there is this pattern of looping theme that has been running throughout the different sets of these Psalms. In each set, at least the first 4 sets, there is this flow from trouble in this world, sung of in the first song, to confidence in God in the second song, followed by the reality of communion with God in the third. And when they are sung together, when those sets are put together, the singer recognizes that in spite of the trouble in this world, there is confidence in God because there is communion with God. But as we come to this final set of 3, Psalm 132 to 134, the primary focus is on communion with the Lord. Over and over, we will be reminded that He is there. That He can be known, that He is working in the lives of His people. The pilgrim singing this song has been traveling many days. The pilgrim is probably tired and weary. They're hungry and dusty, and they might be wondering why. Why go through all this trouble? And these last 3 songs answer that. And they do so by reminding them that they are the people of God. That Zion, that Jerusalem, at the temple, they will be in the presence of their Lord. Again, they will be in the right place. So this week we're going to look at Psalm 132, a song focused on, again, the theme of communion with the Lord, speaking about His faithful promises to His people. Let's read this psalm together and then work our way through it. Psalm 132, a song of ascents. Remember, O Lord, in David's favor, all the hardships he endured. How he swore to the Lord and vowed to the mighty one of Jacob. I will not enter my house or get into my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob. Behold, we heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Jaar. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you in the ark of your might. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, and let your saints shout for joy. For the sake of your servant David, do not turn away the face of your anointed one. The Lord swore to David a sure oath from which he will not turn back. One of the sons of your body I will set on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and my testimonies that I shall teach them, their sons also forever shall sit on your throne. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. I will abundantly bless her provisions. I will satisfy her poor with bread. Her priests I will clothe with salvation, and her saints will shout for joy. There I will make a horn to sprout for David. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed. His enemies I will clothe with shame, but on him his crown shall shine. If we look at this psalm, we can see that there are two distinct parts here in these 11 verses. There is prayer and there is oaths. There is two prayers and there are two oaths. The two prayers are found in verse 1 and verse 10, and both of them are prayed by Israel that God might remember. And then there are two oaths or vows, verses 2 through 9 and verses 11 through 18. The first oath, verses 2 to 9, is a record of David's oath to the Lord, a promise that David makes to God. The second oath, the second vow, is the one that the Lord makes to David. We're going to look at the psalm with these two distinct parts in mind. Now, David's name, as we see in the psalm, is prominent. However, it's important to note that he is not the author. Most likely, this psalm was written at or just following the building of the temple during the time of Solomon. Now, this was something that David was passionate about. David worked hard to prepare for the temple to be completed in Jerusalem. In 1 Chronicles 17 verse 1, David says, "Behold, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of the covenant of the Lord is under a tent." He says, this doesn't make sense. I live in a warm, dry, secure home, but the ark of the covenant, the presence of God, is dwelling in the wilderness under fabric. However, after this declaration, and during the preparation for the building of the temple, the Lord tells Nathan the prophet to tell David that David's not going to be the one that builds the temple. And the reason for that is because David's life and his rule has been filled with bloodshed and war. And so this task of building the temple in Jerusalem is going to pass to his son Solomon. Now, I think many of us would probably take this as hard news. I'm going to guess that this is not what David, number one, wanted to hear or even expected to hear. And yet, as you read in Chronicles this account, David saw beyond that. And David actually saw this as a great blessing to him because his descendants would sit on the throne. God was going to be faithful to his promises. Solomon will reign. And if you read the story of Israel, we see that. Solomon ascends to the throne. Solomon builds the temple. And the temple becomes the permanent place of worship for Israel. And so with that background in mind, this song begins with the prayer. Remember, O Lord, in David's favor, all the hardships he endured. Now, we do need to be careful with this. This is not distrust on the part of the psalmist. The psalmist here is not questioning whether God has forgotten or has changed his mind. But simply, they are aligning their hearts upon what God has said. And they're bringing that in prayer before the Lord. And we see this all throughout the Psalms. Not just the Psalm of Ascent, but all throughout the 150 Psalms. Times of trouble that feel like they should not be. Heartache and suffering, enemies rising up against. Even David faced this. We're told here in this passage that he experienced hardships. Think of some of the examples of David in his youth. He's chased by King Saul. When he becomes king, his reign, there is much trouble. Even his own son tries to dethrone him. Throughout his life, the Ark of the Covenant was not near. And yet there is trust that the Lord is faithful to his promises. The Lord is working. And the pilgrim brings that before the Lord by recalling the life of David and the oath that David makes before the Lord. In verses 2 through 9, we get a glimpse of David's passion for the glory and honor of God. Again, David worked hard that God's glory might be on display in Jerusalem. His glory might be on display in the temple, even when he knew that he personally would not see it. There's a couple of ways in which we see David's passion for the glory and honor of God. First, we see how zealous David is for this. What does David say here in these verses? He says, I will not enter my house. I will not get into my bed. I will not sleep until I find a dwelling place for the Lord. David is set on accomplishing what he said he would do. There's nothing greater for David than to know the presence of the Lord. And I think this is really a challenge for us as God's people. A challenge to our own hearts to question, do I have a heart of worship like this? Is my passion to meet God, to walk in his ways? Am I zealous that God would be honored and glorified? Do I desire to gather with God's people for worship? This is what is on the heart of David as he seeks to prepare for the building project of the temple. Now, David, in some ways, is a great example to us, but he's also points out the struggles that we face as sinful humans, because David struggled with this. And just like David, our eyes are tempted to be taken off of the Lord, to seek satisfaction in other things. Like David's sons, the future kings of Israel, God's word, God's ways might be forgotten. They might be laid aside. They might be ignored. And we feel this in our lives. We struggle with this. And I think it's why we need this psalm today. It's why the pilgrim making their way to Jerusalem needed this song. They felt that tension. Why go through all this trouble? Now, in the immediate, this is not going to really be addressed. We're going to get there towards the end of this psalm. But it's important that as we hear David's passion here, that we ask ourselves those questions. Is this my heart of worship before the Lord? The second thing we notice about David's passion for God's glory and honor is that it is rooted in history. It's rooted in history. If you look at verse 6, you can almost picture David here as a young boy living in Ephrathah, otherwise known as Bethlehem. And the family that David grew up in, it's a family that loved the Lord. It's a family that knew the story of the Exodus. It's a family that knew God's presence was with his people in the tabernacle. But it's also a family that knew the struggle because the ark is not with God's people. In fact, in 1 Chronicles chapter 13, David mentions how during Saul's reign, Saul did not seek the Lord's presence. The ark was kept at a distance. The ark was almost forgotten. And so as you read David's life as he becomes king, the longings of this young boy in Bethlehem are carried on later in life. In verse 9, David is serious about proper worship. He mentions the need for godly priests, for those who will take care of God's people spiritually and be serious in worship. And this is a lesson that David learned the hard way. Again, part of his own history and experience. In 1 Chronicles 13, there is tragedy when one of the priests named Uzzah does that which they are not to do. He reaches out and he touches the Ark of the Covenant. And upon doing so, death is immediate. And the lesson there in that narrative, one of the lessons, is that worship matters. And David is serious in leading God's people in right worship. But thirdly, David's passion for God's glory and honor is rooted in longer history than just his own life. But it's a history that stretches back to the Exodus. Look at verse 8. Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. I just think about this for a moment. Back in the wilderness wanderings, the Lord's presence led the people. Fire at night, cloud during the day. The tabernacle set up in the midst of Israel as they camped. Again, God was there. God was present with his people. And the story of the wanderings, the coming into the promised land, the establishing of Jerusalem are clear examples of the Lord fulfilling his promise to his people of rest. And as they settle into their land that God has given to them, David knows the need for the Lord to be present with them. For the ark to not be out into the wilderness, to not be forgotten, to not be laid aside, but rather that God's presence would be central in the life of Israel. Now again, this oath was given by David to the Lord. This is his heart of worship, his passion for God's glory and honor. But as singers, as faithful pilgrims, this was their heart as they reflect back on David's oath and look forward to their time of worship in Zion. To be in the presence of God. To worship the mighty one of Jacob. And again, as we listen in on this first half of the song, we are led to examine our hearts. Not only to question, are we zealous for the Lord, as we saw in verses 2 through 5, but does knowing God fill our desires and actions? So some practical questions to ask ourselves. Is Sunday the only time we think on the Lord and his ways? Or is our home, is our daily life a place where we seek the presence of God? Why do we come to church? Do we come to worship the Lord, or is there some other motivation? Do we come to church to make someone happy? To enjoy socializing with kind and friendly people? To engage in an activity with my preferences and traditions in mind? The reality is none of those things are wrong, but all too often they are why people come to worship. And they turn into expressions of people worshiping self rather than God. Why do we gather for worship? The third question to ask ourselves is, do we truly know who God is? Do we truly know that he is the mighty one, that he is the one who is on the throne? Almighty, sovereign, Lord of all, in the midst of his people. This is what the pilgrim is singing about. This is what carries them to Jerusalem. This is why they pray to the Lord. Well, that brings us to the second half of the song, to another prayer and another oath. Look at verse 10. For the sake of your servant David, do not turn away the face of your anointed one. This prayer, like the first, has David in focus. But unlike the first prayer that looked back on his life, this one looks forward on God's promises to David. God's promise that David's descendants would occupy the throne and that Jerusalem would remain a safe and secure place for God's people. As a traveler to Jerusalem, you can understand why this song is of such importance. Why it's included in this songbook. The city of God is the city where God's people gather to meet their God. Well, this prayer is followed by the recounting of God's oath to David. We've already mentioned the overall nature of this oath. It is David's descendants reigning on David's throne. But there are a few things to note about this oath. First, there are conditions that must be met. Look at verse 12. If your sons keep my covenant. The Lord's promise is to bless Israel, and part of that blessing comes through godly leaders. Godly leaders who lead with the people's best interest in mind. But the Lord's highlighting here that if that doesn't happen, if David's heirs live unholy lives or rule in ungodly ways, there will be consequences. If you read the story of Israel, following the life of David, you will note that there are kings who seek the Lord, and there are kings who do not. And the contrast could not be more stark between the two. For those who seek the Lord in his ways, there is great blessing in Israel. But for those who seek self, there is times of great trouble and sin and idolatry. However, in spite of this, the singer is reminded that the Lord remains faithful. Notice the repeating word throughout this psalm, the word forever. When the Lord speaks a promise, he keeps his promise. The Lord is faithful even when we are unfaithful. And what we see on display in the story of Israel and in the unfaithful kings is the importance and grace of God's discipline in the lives of his people. He disciplines, he corrects so that we might know him. And that really brings us to the second thing that we see. God's oath to David flows from God's love for his people. Notice the language of love that runs through verses 13 through 15. Chosen, desired, abundantly blessed, satisfied. There is no doubt that the Lord loves his people. He has chosen them as his own. He desires to be in their midst. He wants to bless and satisfy them. The heart of God for the people of Israel is one marked by extraordinary love. This is why the Lord calls for godly leadership. Godly leadership is a blessing to his people. And the Lord wants to bless his people because he loves his people. And not only is this blessing felt in this world, but more importantly, it is felt spiritually, because it's not just the kings that are mentioned here, but in verse 16, the leadership of the priests. They are to point people to the good news of God's salvation. Here is true and lasting blessing. Here is the love of God that causes God's people to shout for joy. Before we get into the third thing seen in this oath, I want to stop for a moment and just reflect upon this point for a minute. As God's people today, we have experienced God's love like seen here in this psalm. He has chosen us before the foundations of the world. He made us in his image to know him, to be in relationship with him. He has blessed us beyond all measure. He satisfies like no one else. He has sent his Son so that we might have everlasting life. And the question for us this morning is, are you joyful? Do you shout for joy over the news of the gospel? In some ways, I think it's a bit of a shame that we don't sing the Psalms regularly. I think this is something that is lacking in the church in general. Because we need the Psalms. We need the doctrine and the theology and the wonderful truths expressed in these songs. But we also need the emotions, the hearts that are drawn to expressive worship of God's majesty and work. The God of the Bible is the only God who truly loves us. The God of the Bible is the only God who we can truly know. The God of the Bible is the only God deserving of worship. This is why the Israelite pilgrims, making these long, tiring journeys, sing these songs. They're headed in the right direction, to be in the presence of their God. And they shout for joy. They sing with delight. They are a happy people. Thirdly, we see that this oath promises sovereign rule. Look at the last two verses, 17 and 18 there. I will make a horn to sprout for David. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed. His enemies I will clothe with shame, but on him his crown will shine. Again, godly ruling and reigning is a supreme blessing to God's people. And this is seen in the images which are mentioned in these last two verses. Three images. First, there is the image of a horn. The horn is a symbol of strength. It is a picture of victory and power and potency. And notice where this strength comes from. It comes from God. The Lord takes that which is ordinary, David, a young shepherd boy living in Bethlehem. What does the Lord do? Bring about power, strength, rule. There is the image of the lamp, bringing clarity and comfort. Godly rule does not point to itself, but rather points to God. It's highlighting the truth. It also brings great comfort. I mean, as a child, what is one of the most frightening things? Darkness. What brings comfort in darkness but a nightlight? David's rule in Israel can be described as a beacon of light in a dark world. He's highlighting the glory and the honor of God and making Zion the secure place for God's people. Thirdly, there is the image of crown, the quintessential picture of rule. The king is on the throne. The king is ruling and reigning. Again, you can see why the pilgrim would love to sing this song. As we've seen throughout, each set begins with trouble and ends with good news. And we have a very similar thing taking place here. The song begins with hardship in verse 1 and ends with glory in the last two verses. This is the way of the Lord. This is how he works. This marks his promises to his people. As we've mentioned before, what awaits the pilgrim in Jerusalem is a time of gathering with God's people, of worshiping the Lord, of experiencing his grace and his mercy in the sacrifices. But most significantly is the anticipation of the coming Messiah, the true and lasting King. All through this series, we have noted how the person and work of Jesus Christ is seen in the Psalms of Ascent, and probably no more so than here in Psalm 132. Maybe in reading verse 6, you think of Christmas, the mention of Ephrathah or Bethlehem. This city of young David is the birthplace of Jesus Christ. Or maybe when you hear of David's sons sitting on the throne forever, your mind goes to the night that the angel visits Mary in Luke 1. Behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And then here it is, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David. As we think about these connections, we are again seeing the faithfulness of God to his promises. The promises of God fulfilled in the most glorious way. Jesus Christ is the horn of salvation. Next week, when we read Revelation chapter 5, John is going to look under the throne, and what does he see there? He sees a lamb. A lamb with 7 horns. Not just one, but 7. Great and perfect power. Jesus is the victorious one. Jesus has defeated our greatest enemy. Jesus is also the lamp. In John's gospel, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. The truth brilliantly shines forth from him. The gospel is made clear. The light of Christ brings comfort in this dark world. He is the light. Jesus Christ is the sovereign ruler. He is King of kings and Lord of lords. His rule and reign is also not just limited to the realm of Israel, but to the whole universe. As we see in this passage, his rule and reign is not limited to the length of an average human lifespan, but rather forever, all eternity. Jesus Christ is the Alpha and the Omega. He is the eternal one, and his sovereign rule matches that of his character. The kingship promised to David, expressed here in song, finds its glory in the person and work of Christ. As we close today, I want to leave us with one question. One question. Who do you worship today? Who do you worship today? If you were an Israelite pilgrim, would you be singing this song? Would you be trusting the promises of God, looking forward to the coming Messiah? Do you shout for joy over salvation that God has granted to you? Do you look with joy to the promises fulfilled and to the promises to come? Do you, like the Israelite pilgrim, look to the Messiah, the one true and living King Jesus? To ultimately answer the prayers in verses 1 and 10, we can go to the passage that we read earlier this morning from Revelation. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. This is who we worship.